Hello everyone, today we talk about the centuries of the alleged closed and just like barter-based economy. This video is actually just a general talk or an introduction, as many of ours can be considered even manualistic, that eventually I focus more in depth. I've already done, of course, about especially these topics that mostly intertwine with the social and political implications of post-colonial Europe, etc. Right, but there is also probably like a dimension of, for example, agricultural, rural history. Let's say that is quite complex, quite complicated in the specifics, and especially very difficult to make for these early medieval centuries. And there is, in fact, for such eras of scarce documentable evidence, always more sort of ideological or debate, or at least one focused on sort of the macroscopic picture as opposed to any heuristically positive way of sorting out exactly what was going on in an absolute quantitative way and so on. So I'm also no historian of economics, so I've never gotten too deep into the sort of the raw problems. In any case, it's obvious that the early Middle Ages were a moment of undeniably difficult living conditions. The early Middle Ages have been presented sometimes like they've been confused just with the migration era in general. Like part of the early Middle Ages, of course, were in that, but say that it's split also with late antiquity. So mostly when we start studying medieval history, it's when, in fact, the migration era is over, right? In different times, depending on the place, right? But generally speaking, what we were discussing just recently about Latin Germanic Europe, it's basically like the mid-6th century, right? And the wars had surely made their own share of damage, destruction, and destabilization, but were general, let's say, conditions of decay, right? And also other, think about the plague. I mean, everything came actually together with this. It's fair to say that wars were probably the most important factor in bringing the system down, but it's mostly like the political situation, the great paradigm shift that occurred like in the first centuries of the Common Era at a moral, spiritual level. It's not to just, it's not necessary to digress on this. But what we see after Justinian's plague, after the last wars of reconquest, etc., is actually, in Western Europe, a moment of substantially peaceful situation. Yes, there were internal clashes between the elites and so on, but overall, like, there was nothing so systemically destructive, right? There weren't, this is the point, there weren't the moral and material resources to go on with that. And actually what we see, in fact, is rather that as a problem. I mean, much has been destroyed, there is hardly any resource to rebuild, and so life was mostly just getting down to the essentials, right? There was a substantially survival rate of economy. The crop yields were pretty scarce, and the structures that could be built upon this for a couple of centuries, and just a couple of centuries, really, not even, maybe 150 years in most cases, were pretty limited. And this is no paradise. This is no like primitively romantic landscape, right? Living out there as a freeman, even though the picture there, in fact, is never quite what we think. It was no actual freedom. It was just probably the single most precarious, miserable, and devastatingly nightmarish situations that everybody was trying to escape. And that's also the reason why early medieval Europe turns itself essentially in a seigneurial system. It already is, right? The passage, like, it It's already been established, right? And this makes also the growth beyond this moment of stagnation also model on that basis. So people were okay even with that hierarchical system, which was not, however, as hierarchical as it would become later. And especially even during the modern age, people have, again, this strange idea that the medieval peasant was sort of more oppressed than a modern one. It's not quite the case, or at least it was not so bound to the land as a modern peasant was. It may have even lived better than a medieval peasant, in fact, and people tend to confuse the two levels. They think, in general, less free equates to, worse living conditions, and the Middle Ages are the Dark Ages, so that must have been the period, right? No, it's completely the opposite. At both levels of this logical fallacy, in fact. This is just populistic, anti-traditionalistic, nationals and or socialistic mental illness from the Enlightenment on. Like, it has nothing to do with today's medieval history, modern history, historiography. It's just like a fantasy fiction. It never existed. In any case, the picture we are describing, again, the broader environment is can be assimilated in different parts of Europe. Of course, we're different, but let's say the wars that had exhausted this, the migrations had depopulated certain areas that were already historically not particularly populated, by the way, so making it even more difficult to say, actually easier if you think that, of course, it was sort of outer land, free for people that came from even worse places, and so for those it would change, but still in a miserable situation, and definitely the others had left for the better land. This would in part render the settlement of certain populations in different areas of Europe unstable, meaning that, in fact, until the 9th to 10th century, we look even at Central Europe, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, etc., you realize that certain politics had yet properly to stabilize into even at an ethnic level, depending on the, also the continuation, by the way, in these places of the migration here, telling the truth, new peoples coming in, but others still being mentally semi-nomadic, right, and possible, like, just prone to move again, right? And just because, again, the land would not support them, or at least there were other options or needs that brought them to move as well. The decay of cities in some areas, especially in the northwest of Europe, where this had existed because of Romanization, but now had been largely abandoned due to the scarcity of the local resources in those specific regions. The shrinking in the cultivated areas, which was a cause and a consequence at the same time of the demographic shrinking, right, to the advantage of forests and swamps that in multiple places had, again, taken over, again, after the great work of reclamation of deforestation of Roman times. The strong fall, even if not without its disappearance, of the commercial activity and also monetary circulation on some scale, right? And these would always remain, but of course in some places they would dramatically fade, especially again in the ones that had less surplus in general. So you can't say which one came first, was one of the consequence of the other. Like, they are all intertwined, they're all part of the same collapse that at the end of the day is moral. It depends on mankind, it doesn't depend on nature, if not like in the measure mankind gives up and nature takes over again. By the 8th century, that had already been witnessing some recovery. According to some estimates, I made some videos about European demographics, but for the shortage of sources, we're talking about largely hypothetical figures. Europe had something like between 15-20 million inhabitants, right? And they were mostly concentrated essentially in Southern Europe, right? So if you think about the Roman Empire, we estimate something like beyond 30 million. You realize how this at worst may have been half. And again, the 8th century is also like a moment of, like, it's not plateau. Consider that roughly 10 plague waves at least had struck those regions that faced the Mediterranean from the mid-6th to the mid-8th century. In the 7th and the 8th century, when you look at Northern and Eastern Europe, and it's difficult to do so just as vectors, like mostly the best we can get is, from Germany, the Western Slavic countries, you witness a greater staticity. These places had also gone underpopulated, and sometimes we again underestimate how much the movements of peoples from these regions had during the migration era had emptied. And of course, yes, there had been, especially with the Slavs, replacing the Germans in some areas, some in fact takeovers, but they were were incomparably less populated areas than they had been before, historically. We also in these areas, by the way, you witness the cultivated area shrinking, right? So proving that there had been a contraction in that way. So just think about this for the migration in Europe, because generally speaking, people think that, I don't know, this was like a change in balance, whatever. No, like the proportions fundamentally in Europe in terms of population had remained pretty similar. It's possible that Southern Europe had been, let's say, had lost more in proportion, right? And that the Germanic or the Slavic element increased at this point proportionally, but there was still a very big divide. And in the higher Middle Ages, you see actually that, in fact, Southern Europe booms again, like to a degree of, like, I don't know, 1/4 of the entire European population concentrated in the Italian peninsula, for example. So not much in this direction had changed over. Like the changes were so small, right? You can easily perceive, like from the sources, how precious, just for example, we see it's military history, the single demographic resources really were for all of these places. But in particular, when you look at the political development of the various areas, especially the one of Central Eastern Europe, were substantially behind at this point. In the landscape, you could also appreciate, as we were saying, the marked predominance of the uncultivated areas. Woods and forests from the Atlantic coast to the Danube, in prevalent steppes in today's Hungary towards the east. The forest covered thus great part of the spaces, and within it, as if they were, island settlements, you find at least some cities and the villages, and some, it depends really what we're talking about, because of course, for example, southwestern Europe at large was not, but even, most of Europe was not literally covered prevalently in forest, right? But of course, the landscape was much less clear than it had been before. There are new communities here and there. In Gaul, in Germany, you find, for example, the world of the forest, in which some communities live really isolated, even from the cities. that were normally still the center of government, as we were saying recently. In other areas, the city still dominates instead pretty much everything, especially in Southern Europe, like in Italy in particular. So it depends really what we're looking at, but the type of communities that inhabited these various environments, of course, had also different characteristics. The same villages were pretty varying in form and dimension. So you would have typically, at least in Central Europe as a general average, the inhabited part that was mostly surrounded by a fence. Then beyond it, you would have a cultivated area all around. This was the village competence, right, with fields that were prevalently designated to cereals, vineyards, at least for those areas, the climate of which could sustain them. Essentially, the boundary of the Roman Empire is the boundary of the wine, right? So Britain, Gaul, parts of Germany, even that were in fact connected even with some substances that could be derived, for example, by the mast, right? More capable of, say, producing at least of preserving food, because some of these substances were capable of preserving even large quantities of cereals. Technicalities, but they had been important. Of course, this is also say that there is such an important divide also because Central, Eastern, Northern Europe are colder, significantly so. Agriculture, of course, resents of that. In fact, that the vineyards can't be grown there in the first place, and this all changes in many ways, like even the mentality of the people we inhabit there. And in many ways, you have loans as well in the surrounding area, while in the outer one, you would see a sort of band of common land, right? We're talking about shared resources practically. That is pastures, forests that are carefully taken care of by the community. This was important for the collection of leaves, wood, branches for especially the pigs feeding, right? The pigs constituting a very important part of early medieval economy, and they ate the nuts and of the oaks, so that you have typically like the woodsman like entering the forest and shattering the tree branches and the nuts falling, the pigs eating, and in all this also cleaning a bit, tying a bit the same forest that was very again say control, like there were paths in it. It was much less of a wild concept of the forest that we have stereotypically, especially for the Middle Ages. Naturally, there were different forests. Some were completely left out there. There were some forests. Think about the great ones in Germany that literally separated entire ethnic, tribal realities, right? Because they were so thick that basically they were just like a geographical boundary per se. And that were, however, still very important in terms of resources. But coming back to the villages, beyond these three areas, so as we've seen, the inhabited one, the cultivated part, and the common lands, there was in fact the forest. Right, there was, in a greater sense, only occasionally penetrated in some areas and used also for hunting, right? And many of these forests were also so precious in general, for the resources could be drawn for that in a more say organized fashion that were normally a public possession, right? Together with, for example, some lakes, some ponds, right, in particular sources that the public authority were discussing the other day was trying to maintain a control of. Legally, Charlemagne himself had intervened on such landscape, right? You don't have to confuse the allodial lands with the beneficiary ones, right? Essentially, the main difference is that, say, the term allod, which was coming from the Germanic allod, right? It was eventually Latinized as allodium, indicated full property. There were people that had maintained such land in this at some point in history. It's practically impossible even to understand this, and then we don't have to think this as, once one guy had proprietary rights. They had, especially the peoples who had settled during the migration era, had been part of a community that possessed people individually, and so it's also, and it was, say, culturally not tied to a specific land just by migratory mentality. It was also just beyond the actual religious, spiritual beliefs of the time. Like what matters, what is heaven, right? It's not. But again, we don't have time to digress on this. But especially some lords, some important magnates in the Frankish world, of course, have some important, say, tradition of control over these. Was settled in one place, exercised an important degree of control, especially on the in fact on the local peasants. There was some concern there, because again, this is mostly a political reason. You could, of course, claim as a king complete public authority. We've seen it, but the practical capacity to dislodge someone, or even just let's say the advantage in the process was not quite there, right? The beneficiary system worked, in fact, on this basis, that you basically allowed somebody that sometimes was already located there to be simply giving you something back for being on that land, or you could just settle him there, like after having taken some land away from somebody who had usurped a certain public right, for example, which were sometimes the same people, do the same thing. I mean, by force extraditing those who lived there and settling the guy who had unseated the sword, and that's how the Carolingians refueled their military clientele, by the way, and service because of the land and all that it entailed. Naturally, there was a hybrid between these two things, because the fief holders evidently had already at the time the tendency to consider this land their own property. There were, however, some limits in theory regarding the specific performances that could be asked in this Vassalatic-Beneficiary relations, especially by whom, right? Because, for example, the same magnate of the kingdom didn't have to ask, must not really by law ask the peasants for the corvée. I made a video specifically on those. So these are, again, some work performances akin in practice, but not in theory, to the public tributes, right? But if this in fact had to happen, only as payment of the lands that had been given in concession to them, right? And the degree that varies. Again, part of the reason why this happens is that, why there is this legal distinction, is that in theory you cannot impose your will over a freedman. Like the kings, as such, are the guys who have to maintain the freedom of their individual subjects. And if you allow just by law someone to just arbitrarily exercise to coerce with the use of force somebody else, well, this is illegal. It cannot be defended at any level, and actually at that point, even as a ruler, you can be disconfessed because you have come less to the primary function of justice that you're elected in theory by this community by. So in a moment of great aristocratization and privatization of the system, what had happened, of course, is that the same public officials, again, it's the cycle that picks the topics. Just the other day I made a video about the Romano-Germanic government. We explained exactly about these figures and what they did, including trying to actually draw advantage from, to profit from the management of their estates, right? The same goes for the large landowners in general, seeking to obtain some working performances of seigneurial type, which is what would evolve in a seigneurial type, at least in a systemic sense with the feudalization of the system. But before this time, when we look even at tribes, etc., like that's how essentially the relations between individuals worked, right? In different measure, there was definitely like it's what we were just saying during the migration era. The peoples who were on the move did not have the land as a power base. So the relations were much more egalitarian in theory, but still, this doesn't mean that people were individually free in absolute terms at all. Like, they were part of the clan. You had just to do what your family told you to do. And of course, there were other options, but we're still becoming warbanders and being under somebody else. So it was always about some sort of hierarchy. In any case, when in fact these lands are all like with Romano-Germanic kingdoms had been established, and legislation became more sort of effective, uniform, like there is a hierarchy that can sort of, in fact, it's the same hierarchy that here is sort of, may sound paradoxical, like abusing of this system, but that was also dosing the measure by which something could be more or less acceptable, because nobody really wanted somebody emerging more powerfully than the others. So, especially the king. And so this work performances were accepted, but only when there was a negotium, essentially, that stated how, of course, like if you owed certain work performances, because you had essentially got into this contractual relation. And so this happened also among freemen. I made multiple videos regarding this ambiguity, this blurring, the distinction of the boundary between a serf and a freeman. There were some serfs that actually headed better into the master's household as de facto freemen than legal freemen that in practice were serfs at the same time. So it would be interesting to make some videos in. I made some about the passage, especially from like the freeing of some serfs in a servile condition, that in some areas, like for example among the Longobards, etc. But it would be very interesting to look at the passage from the tribal settlement into like this, more seigneurial direction, because it's how, in fact, peoples like the Franks really developed the most powerful clienteles in Europe and succeeded in even taking over the rest and molding it on their own same basis, practically. So this was the deal, trying to check the more powerful, right? A power sharing situation, which, again, mafia style, in which you, even at the highest level, you try to balance things out in the absence of an actual state. All right, the Capitulare de Villis, for example, is from Charlemagne's time. This law was concerned with the orderly management of the royal domain, curtas. The royal domain was de facto like the private property of the king, but still being endowed with this public domain status that made it like the crowns, and so like less touchable than all the others. And it did encompass, in fact, some, as we were saying before, some general prerogatives, relations with the communities, the control of some particular resources that were quite strategical for the royal economy, etc. And the Curtes, the Curtis is a term that, as you know, is it really means like the court, meant in a manorial sense, right? And so, as we will see, the Anglo-Saxons had the manor that was smaller compared to continental. The continental Curtis, but it's pretty much the same thing, and that's how the term is known in Carolingian Europe, also in other countries, because it depends on how the Latin term was standardized, because at the end of the day, the economy was not that different, right, from these various eras. And obviously enough, those guys who were put at the head of these Curtes on behalf of the king were essentially beginning to abuse of their rights for personal ends, right? So from the documents we have from the Carolingian era, we realize that besides the king, also other large landowners had Curtes on their own, because they were starting to organize just the internal management of the land in the same way that the king would. And today's video has to do with the concept of the Curtes, that, as we just described in the concept of the court, of the circle, the defense, the fortified area, gives almost this claustrophobic idea of especially of paranoid need of defense. Oh my God, everybody entrenched in the Curtes and in the Mountain Bailey Castle, and wait, there is a dark, scary world outside. Not at all, right? There is this other idea, of course, that is still somehow, it's been surpassed historiographically, but it's very common to hear, like the idea of a closed system, right? At the early Middle Ages were this moment of, oh my God, something of self-subsistence, of just no contact with the outer side. Of course, as we were saying before, here we're talking also towards the higher Middle Ages, because the 8th century basically begins that, and so it's slightly different from the previous centuries. Still, it's now, in terms of production, we witness nothing glamorous, but the fact that the system was becoming more hierarchical stimulates the rationalization, the unity of management, the various strategies and policies which this land, the people inhabiting it, the resources that were produced would be used. And actually, predictably, the hierarchization actually talks to us about a wider range of interaction. In fact, of course, there was a much narrower range of interaction when the free peasants were out there than when the Curtes is established, because the former had no clue how to make anything collectively organized work. They didn't have the means, and the system eventually evolves, and those who have more power form this sort of greater union and manage to interact at much greater ranges, moving greater amounts of goods, having like a greater vision, longer range interaction, sort of capacity of thinking. It is also true that almost all the great early medieval estates were, until essentially after the year 1000, organized in Curtes, right? And this system had evolved straight from the old Roman ville, right? And actually they kept calling themselves ville in other ways, right? They were literally the same things that had survived. In fact, think about how much we have conceptualized the fact that the system ended but did not, it just shrank. And in many areas, the thing went on just on the same estate base, right? And they were founded on the principle of sort of the mixed management of the land. That is to say, one part of this estate was managed by a great landowner. The other instead was parceled, and these plots were entrusted to colonists. All right, this is in part the basis of, in fact, the same court, because the former would be like the Dominicum or Pars Dominica, right? Because the dominus, the master, was in fact indicated with this term, which was enriched eventually with deeper meaning, like the one properly of rule, right? Also in the banal lordship, and made videos about this. But again, I can't digress at every definition. We can define this central, say, don't think it even geometrically or necessarily in a geometrical way, like maybe the Pars Dominica was concentrated just in one part of the essay, right? But eccentrically to the rest, right? But this could also be called seigneurial reserve, because also lots of the agricultural surplus was collected there, hence the place was fortified, hence encastellation, hence how also the feudal system was developed further. The part of the land indirectly managed, that is to say by these colonists, was instead the massaricium, or pars massaricia, from the massari, where again the guys who worked over these plots, known as the mansi, which was the standard unit of measurement, even though say not from a in an absolute term, but more from a market point of view, the mansi could vary in size. Within the Dominicum, however, the master used prevalently servile manpower, because there he could simply use these guys as his property. The salaried working force was very rare in this part. Like we know just some examples in Northern Europe, particularly in the British Isles, that from the point of view of the large estates, sort of very different from the continent, because there is a sort of smaller but more compact agrarian business, the manor, right? Think about also the minster. I mean, there is early on some sort of greater compaction, even properly the community that lives within it, and the master, but for reasons that we will see better in another video. In any case, that favored, in a sense, the exchange of some specialized workers they would send from a place to another. On the continent, there was enough manpower just to have a sort of more diversified, also availability of the same in its specialties. Now, the colonists of the Massaricium paid a rent, right, that was usually a very long-term one, either lifelong, for example, or hereditary, right? The amphitheusis was an old system used since Roman times, was particularly typical of the ecclesiastical estates, right? Basically, you would give for, say, 99 years this land to a family to work on it, and literally 3 generations later or more, you would essentially renovate that contract, because where do you go after that? And unless, of course, you have screwed up in some way, so you're kicked out of the land, because that technically belongs, and especially in the case of the church, in fact, with a much greater and direct authority, like the church, especially if you look at the surrounding of Rome, like they literally controlled almost everything. It had a very powerfully Roman way of seeing in that case, the public domain overlapping with ecclesiastical property, like the Church of St. Peter, but that's another story. But it was very common also in the rest of Europe, right? The canons were paid in nature or with money, depending on the circumstances, but frequently with both at the same time. This was done also by performing a certain number of working days on the Dominicum, so that the famous corvée that we mentioned before. In Latin, the equivalent corvaria, corvata, corresponded to the concept of forced requests of some sort. The most common corvée were the agrarian ones, and not the ones demanded by the lord for example, the upkeeping of a castle of a road. Right? They were not, also because the guy would actually take care of that in a more direct way, or at least with a more, specialized fashion. They were not required to, like, evenly to the community, right? There was a degree of arbitrariness to it, and there wasn't actually a seigneurial political imposition, but it was a form of, in some occasions, literally a form of rent payment, right? For the peasants that had this contract with the landowner. With this form of management, the Dominicum could thus employ some working force, including also the agricultural tools employed by it, etc. It was not much, as we said before. That's just that the crop yield would not allow you to get too much surplus. You could integrate it with the working force coming from the Massari, right? And this is what the characterizing element of what has been defined the courtly system really is. The idea that the courtes, so that the system revolving around it, entailed a allegedly closed and self-sufficient system based on barter, essentially, with, by the way, purely natural payments, and not something more developed, like with monetary circulation and the influence of the market. This was very much of an idea spread since the 19th century by authors like Alphonse Dopsch, right? And it corresponded to a view of the community of, in many ways, a conservative, a conservative limiting idea. The idea of the empire was, say, criticized to some degree, and so the national element was seen as more important. So the national element was more parceled, and even though it sort of stressed some allegedly, in fact, nationwide characters at the time, there was still the idea that, it's our own place, our own confine. We want to remain alone, isolated from the rest, not mixing with the rest. And so, again, the imperial Catholic tradition and real European tradition is something much more powerfully wielded at the time. Like in this one, of course, there were some socialist delusions that are much worse also at the time. But you see, the idea remained so much, and that today many people still think about that. For example, in the in the 20th century, you still see the so-called minimalists that wanted to stress the fact that, again, the system was so poor, and that the Middle Ages sucked more or less, and especially the Dark Ages, and so everything was just revolving around this poverty. And we know from the last generations instead that there was a rather capillary spread of, for example, weekly markets during the 10th century, which is actually one of the single most overlooked ones in the entire history of mankind, because what happened in Europe there was founded a boom that is at the roots of Western civilization and its dominance globally. It's that idea which could, you see, while you can even archaeologically document a courtes, it's more difficult to see the market in the same way. And so people fixated on the topographic fragmentation, so the idea of many different villages, for example, and so they're courtes and more, and so, but not much the interconnection actually existing between them, right? It's true that the sources, such as the Capitulare Bills, tell us that, at least suggested as a plan and theory, that the administrators of the larger cortes were to pursue some objectives of self-sufficiency. But aside from the fact that these were hardly ever reached, it's obvious that you may want to have stocks, you want to be fully supplied. The kings, the emperors at that point were in Charlemagne's time, so hardly a closed system, like an empire dominating half of Europe. Evidently, in that point, using this court as a logistical basis and some function that had to say, you must produce for yourself that given amount. Don't take it from somewhere else, because it's still our empire and we need these resources in a way that, you can't simply cheat about, right? So that's the message. It doesn't mean that the system was even remotely an autarkic one. Often, all the forms of payment of land and census, that is in nature, in money, but also in labor, coexisted. This is normal because just like the way you run a farm and estate in general works like that. The prevalence of one or the other followed thus also irregular patterns. We can't say, for example, that in the early Middle Ages the canons paid in nature were just normally the most prevalent. And so that gradually they were substituted by the monetary one. There were some phases in the centers of the Middle Ages for which the special advantages that the market reserved to the seigneurial economy were such to make the master prefer the product to sell, translatable in a sum of money that consisted in that he would have essentially gained from the direct monetary payments of the peasants. So there is not such a single pattern picture of, say, at some point it was just natural economy or monetary economy. And because it's just a mean of exchange, right? The product is basically the same, so it doesn't even matter too much. At least in the 20th century, this was still believed at some point. And yes, you can say that, of course, in the early Middle Ages there is less money circulating, but there is also less resources circulating in the first place. So it really depends what we're looking at. A certain possibility of the colonists, by the way, having some money, literally, is frequently witnessed. It's confirmed also by the existence of small local markets, to which sometimes the peasant families could be able to bring their products, right, in the good years of harvest, or also just cultivating small plots of land that were subtracted from the uncultivated areas without the master of the cortes spotting it or even caring actually about that, or was enough, like it to have this extras, let's say. And it was again not so typically a positive outcome, but the general situation allowed that. Widening with entrepreneurial spirit and harsh sacrifices, indeed, and in a certain sense even abusively, your own cultivated land, the peasant family could afford also a small quota of product that could could just escape the dominus control. Like it could help to increase actually the family consumption levels to ensure some little income, extra income. This is particularly relevant because in general, like you do see the system, as we're saying, for just growing at a point, like that the world becomes a bit more orderly, tighter, civilized, and people also improve their own life quality in spite of the fact that, again, they're juridically and formally their freedom was being reduced. So it really depends on the circumstance, but also in general, in the way you want to see these patterns, really, and all the possibilities that were there, even just theoretically, when you can't maybe strictly document it because it's almost impossible in a systemic statistical sense. Consider that in the various vicissitudes that occurred in Europe at this point politically, the rise and fall of the Carolingian Empire, etc. Like, people would mostly live where they were, like in Western Europe especially, like the level of sedentarism was very high, and in spite of certain deportations or destructions, more or less, essentially these communities were literally going through all this, the wars, in fact, all the problems, etc., would largely remain tied to their lands. Which means that in terms of, for example, power changes, whichever noble was, whichever lord they had, right? And so whichever relations they could formally or informally establish with him, the peasants, in fact, would receive this land by their masters to work. With contracts that were permanently not written, in part because, of course, literacy was not really much there, but more importantly because the political instability had just mostly produced these customs and tendencies that, of course, in part were being sedimented as, okay, if you were the new lord, you would have been told by the local peasants how things worked. There were ways, even for public authority, to investigate. In this, we have very beautiful inquiries sometimes, especially in the most literate parts of Europe, that really show us the world behind us, the intertwinement with the churches. Again, it's a much more complex picture than just, let's study economic history. Economic history is the single most overrated one, probably, in branch like of history that we can look at. Perhaps even more than archaeology, but it's at least narrowly met, not a branch of history. In any case, the Massaritum workers, at least in a first phase of the courtly history, as we were recalling before, were prevalently and juridically free. This is an important discriminant because it's obvious that the Massari, as we've seen, were working on somebody else's land by contract, so they had to contract that with their own personal power, right, and freedom. So even if de facto lots of these people were, if not majority, living in serf-like conditions, they were still free, and there were ways politics could make leverage on this. And this is also probably not the video to talk about it, but there are many examples of certain prerogatives that certain communities, for example, had enjoyed that at some point are usurped by this or that power. It could be a monastery, a lord, the same lord, and there is a higher authority, like, I don't know, the local duke or the king that these guys appeal to, and there is literally a historical inquiry. Say, who did rule on these land? It was basically the single most central question of these. Say, basically of all the charters we know about. I mean, all the sentences, all the trials. Whose land is this? Because the ways, again, the communities, the masters, as they would interact with one another, public districts themselves, and about the frontier problems, like this land is mine, now it's mine because the border passes here, not there. That's sort of typical, and it's connected to the relative autonomy and sort of also lack of control, lack of coercion that authority had at the time. So this would be the natural consequence. The small landowners, so the freehold, the free landowners, technically possessing some allodia, if you want, were still rather numerous in the early Middle Ages for the reasons we've seen. Public authority was even weaker, so these guys technically were out there as freemen, and not so much time had passed from the time in which they were considered as such. They had slaves, they were under some, as we were saying before, some clan leader of sorts, so they were not absolutely free, nor there was really like a patent for a single guy to tell you, oh yes, you're free or whatever. Again, this was actually one of the wildest moments in which people just made justice with one another through feuds and say, I don't know, I carve an eye out of you, so okay, I will carve an eye from one of your relatives and we're okay. And things literally worked like this, as they had worked before, by the way, in the Barbaricum, where the thing is not documented, if not from these laws that start being written down at the time. The field generalized center was that their freedom was at stake, right, in danger. But this is what paradoxically, together with, say, the real dynamic that was, showing this, that was definitely concretizing such fear. The interest of these individuals brings to depend increasingly on the large estates owners. In other words, in order to safeguard their own liberty, they give part of it to these more powerful guys. They are the only ones that sort of can defend them from other guys that want to take that away from them. But in this sense, more likely you have just to choose under who's bigger, more powerful guy you want to be under. And this obviously not, because we know during the 9th to 10th century there is a military class developing. These are the real rulers, and there is a general crisis in which the freemen do not evidently have the power to withstand this power increase. And this, if you look at it in perspective, again, is not even beginning at the time. It's always been there. Like, again, as the Germanic peoples settled in this land, the first problem you have is that one. Land makes individuals more powerful than others, certain individuals more powerful than others, and as such, there is, especially in the lack of strong powers, like the incapacity of really controlling this mechanism. There's a gentrification of the individual that, instead of being a raider in a world of migration, of war, etc., is now settling down and says, phew, this is better than how I lived before. But he doesn't count the fact that he is actually, for that gain, like, there are other people that are gaining much more in the meanwhile, and these are often, again, the same clan leaders under which they already were. So you understand how shaded it is of the myth of the freeman out there, pure and noble, and that doesn't exist. It actually only exists, if it existed at some point, in the municipal civic realities, were really, like, the entire body was much more conservative about their individual liberties, because they were individually simply more endowed to a degree that was also one of command over the countryside, etc., but was in fact more organized, more disciplined in the first place. It's at this point, in fact, that you see also in the military rules, in other videos, the decline of the general levy, right, of able-bodied freemen, and the rise of private regiments on horseback that are really literally overrunning the opponents on foot and so on. This is not to say actually that the peasantry was not organized militarily, or that until the 12th, the 13th century, that they were fairly dangerous for the same cavalry, and that they were an important part of the rural political power leverage. This is the myth. In fact, the opposite of this is the myth that you have propagated by the idea, oh my god, the Middle Ages were so terrible, people were so exploited and oppressed. Actually, the means to do that lacked, and still in the moment in which we had those means, we evolved as a civilization into more powerful states, more powerful, better life quality. So it's, again, the usual populistic paranoia that makes people actually lose their individual freedom, as was happening at this time, by the way, because these guys could have technically had a chance even against the aristocracy if they had wanted to think that, but they were incapable of doing so, and the reason is that they had not become aristocracy themselves. There was, of course, a capacity of, again, a military coordination organization. The lords had fortified their farms. They could put, this is very important, at the disposal of their retinues, but in emergency cases, the entire communities, and that's why the latter became so dependent on them. Large magazines, warehouses for men, animals, like the products in the face, say during, for example, an enemy attack, right? So the seigneurial reserves played an enormous role in the organization of the entire system, because even before the sort of the blackmail, like the enemy raids that were not even so, yes, they were frequent, but it's not even from this far away foreigners that at a certain point appear randomly on the top of the hill overlooking the village and make ha-ha, and then start raping and burning. Yes, these things did happen, but it's, first of all, it was carried out mostly by the same people altogether, like the lords with the peasants on other people's lands, more often than not. And secondly, and that's where, of course, the seigneurial system would become handy, because you could defend people in the Dominicum that was fortified. Hopefully it would exist, but it's in peacetime rather than that. The capacity of stocking those supplies incarnated the power that the lords had, and the degree of hierarchy of the system that had been formed, right? This is why many small landowners made the sentient choice to renounce to the full property of their own land in exchange for the, for example, the certainty or the guarantee of remaining the tenants on their own lands, which depended on the landowner. So this, of course, speaks of the actual need by these people, like a defense of protection, which came together with all these literal seigneury that was being affirmed on them, so that it was defensive but also exploitative. But it was all done, the term exploit is actually a neutral one, and there is nothing wrong in exploiting people legally and freely. The idea is that However, the power of these guys is declining, and we don't again have to think that the masters imposed this. It was a contract, right? It developed like it. So they would receive the protection of Great Lord. They would be able to, in fact, exploit themselves, like the fortifications and other defensive systems of the Great Cortes. So these peasants literally commended themselves to the landowner. They entrusted themselves to. In the Frankish Commendatio, I made a video in the very early days of Schwerpunkt talking about this. Is eventually it. And these commendati thus would donate their own property to the landowner, maintaining the right to use it. This also was part of their contractual power. They could not simply be dislodged from there. At least they were not largely in the condition of wanting it or hoping for it. So that's another story. But they still considered themselves as a community because they were not atomic individuals. Like, they lived in the village, they were part of that world now, right? So it's just something but they were even proud of being under that lord for that matter. This is very clear in many even literary works of the time. Of course, we do not know what the peasants specifically thought directly of it, but these are very clear indicators of the fact that they joined willingly this or that lordship. Thus they would pay their census and being part of the game. Right. Their lands entered to be like part of the courtly system. In particular, they would contribute to the development of the Massaricum. They would remain colonists on them, as this lands had originally been entrusted for that purpose to them. This form of growing of the Cortes was very meaningful, especially in the 10th century, the age of the second invasions, but mostly the one of properly the rebuilding from the basis of this new seigneurial system after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. And this constitutes also an explanation, among the others, of the non-compact form of many of these seigneuries, because again the power had been significantly fragmented, and it's impossible even on a map to simply depict such courtly extensions. Some stretches of it would extend everywhere. By the way, the new peasants had decided to become colonists, right? These, let's remember, were freemen with their own land, and they decided to enter to be part of that seigneury. And so the Lord said, okay, well, where are you? Can I defend you? Yes, kind of. So different parts, like this was all distributed in very articulated ways, like with even other seigneuries superimposing. Other lords could share power on the single communities, but it's that messed up, right? Surely, by the way, the small property never disappeared entirely. Certainly, however, the Cortes of the large property lived a phase of major expansion, and the peak reached brings to the to transform further the Cortes. The Dominicum was becoming smaller, and the Massaricum was widening, in part because the lords were becoming part of a greater hierarchy. So even if they didn't have literally a Dominicum stretching over like vast extents, with, I don't know, greater castles, greater recognition, other power, other income, they could simply extend their seigneury over other communities and just irregimenting them ever more functionally within this hierarchy, and the cannons had to be paid to him, and so the power he could wield, which was advantageous for everybody involved. Thus, evermore, the medieval countryside was characterized by not just free colonists, but two distinct categories of serfs: the domestic ones that remained to work under the direct dependence of the master, of the dominus, that granted them just like a house, food, and then the so-called housed serfs that were entrusted with some months in it, and that now could be even compared to the free colonists because of the general standard. There were so many of them, after all, that they didn't say that it was easier to leave them with a degree of autonomy than oppressing them. It would have required too much cost and would have brought to too few income. So the freeing of the serfs, and in some cases this happened collectively, together with the shifting of many of them within the Massaritum, now people began to be ever more moved, displaced, because new land was being now worked. There was enough manpower to sort of organically start, deforesting, reclaiming some territories, and the bigger the seigneury, the bigger the organization, in a sense. This depended also on the actual income of the seigneury, but don't underestimate desperation as the trigger for deforestation or reclamation, because it's not that the crop yield really increases at any time. That's all this point. Like, there's no revolutionary tools or techniques that make the game different from what agriculturally things had been working before. And this is why, like, actually in some poorer areas, people need to expand or to move. This is also how, for example, the Viking era was triggered, because literally they start expanding and there is no land locally for everybody. This is an important dynamic. Right, but generally speaking, like all this, like the most effective development is within continental Europe, is within post-Carolingian Europe, because it's a much more hierarchically managed and better off system in the first place, even for the individual peasants. You have sometimes, of course, also coercion, right? You have to accept, for example, the serf status of the mansi by some, for example, freemen that were without work. There is some coercion, violence, but overall, this is also like the happening at the margin of society. There is a coexistence within the same villages of families of freemen and one of serfs, to whom the lord tended to actually impose, which he tended to impose, if these communities, by the way, did not protest, which could also, again, they did have a negotiable power of some sort, the same imposition, right? So the same conditions, right? So what was the difference there between the serf and the freeman at that point? What do we mean by that? It's not entirely, important rather than clear, as you understand. these factors, in fact, determine a certain tendency of to the, say, homogenization of the peasant condition. Right. Mark Bloch stressed, for example, the fact that no serf was really a property of the master. This was a thing existing in the early Middle Ages, but now it wasn't such a thing anymore. The slave in the ancient world was a property. At this point, instead, the Romano-Germanic society had changed, and there was no need to treat, also think about Christianity, but the general improvement even of part of the living condition of the entire system made it useless for it to simply treat these individuals like objects. We've seen how precious the demographic resources had been in the time of crisis, so you had to rethink the way you would even see humanity to some degree after the end of the Roman Empire. What did happen morally? Like, these are the questions that bring to the same evangelization of Europe. It's people see it in a sort of strange power struggle, whereas it's just the moral tempers of the time that it's not devoid of power struggling, but it's also about, say, a change that occurs beyond the individual struggles to a degree that is universal in this world. And the places where slavery keeps existing are actually the most underdeveloped in the north and in the east. So this also tells you how inconsistent the idea of the oppression, also the terrible Christianization, and all this nonsense under any single point of view, any indicator and factual evidence, like it really is. But there are lots of people who think that being free means, that I don't know, a Viking was just had a better life quality than an average person in top peasant in continental Europe, right? And it's very difficult to make as a point in the first place. But even like if you compare a Scandinavian farmer compared to a farmer in continental Europe, or if you look at the same military, like how these people were organized, so you realize that there's no comparison. So while liberty had been eroded, right, and even through the imposed, like the enforcements of certain servile living conditions, we find a generalized order and further improvement and higher levels of growth than when this thing had not existed, where these were serfs essentially, and they were sort of living better than what the average person had done in the time in which they were still slaves. And maybe they weren't slaves, they were freemen, as well as seen, but did not live as well as this was at this point in history. It is not to say that it was not a miserable condition of some sort, right? But when you compare certain realities, you realize that being just out there without anybody over you means that very often you're leading a much riskier life than you think. And there are not better options to succeed out there, right? Just by saying, okay, but I'm free now. Like, it's, especially when, this is not, this is moral history, as we explained since the beginning. But if you look at it from the material point of view, which is a reflection of the moral one, you realize that there was not even properly the room for that, right? In Finland, I don't know, slavery lasted until I think the 17th century. Why, according to you? You look at the peasantry, they said, these were free, normally, were so autonomous. Yes, but they were extremely poor. and they didn't have much of a local organization. They were exposed to just other countries who simply ruled over them. And was it that awareness, I don't know, civic spirit or whatever, it was just like brutal, right? So again, never make the mistake of thinking that that's better than what a peasant could experience in France or in Germany. Like with all the differences in this, like there are countries in which peasants have it worse than others. Generally speaking, the more primitive systems have it worse. And again, even within Western Europe, this is sort of very, very self-evident to an extent. Many freemen, small landowners or colonists in conditions of personal as clear juridical liberty, were fully free and without any mistake or ambiguity about this. Like, so there was a room in the West, and perhaps I didn't stress this too much on my channel. I mean, I never denied it, but I never focused on it particularly. It's like an aspect of, like, everybody's a peasant, so everybody's a sort of serf. Not really. Like, the majority, yes, de facto is like a sort of serf. But aside from the fact that many were technically still free, there were literally free people living in their own land and going with it, right? Or maybe living in a town and having the land outside. This was very typical, even up to, like, you can relate part of my family, for example. If you look at the town of my great-grandfather, this guy was a miller, and he worked on sharecropping for the landowner, and my great-grandfather had World War I veteran. He had a house in the town, and he went working on the land, and he had some land on his own as well. And first, this was in a time in which feudalism did not exist anymore, but just for saying that, just the relations existing between the master, the Massarius, so we can say it's actually very, very recent, and maybe it's something you can easily relate to, giving you something to imagine. So here we have also to get rid of a broader cliche. That is, in fact, that the medieval countryside, we're talking the West mostly, don't think like in the East it was really wild, right? In Central Europe already things were starting to be a bit more messed up, and in the East let's not talk even about that. I'm talking Eastern Europe. We talk the countryside especially. Here I will not digress in the national differences, but let's stick to the West. There wasn't such a thing like you see on movies and memes, etc. Like, you know, the countryside is in some, say, homogeneously inhabited by these servants, right? Under some lord, right? The idea of a peasant, of a serf that is tied to his land, had been existing by reasons of major force. We've seen it since the Capitatio Iugatio of Diocletian, but again, the concept of a person to retain his original freedom and the quite variegated capacity of individuals to elevate their status through different endeavors, could be economical, military, political, civic, whatever, is in fact a 19th century sort of invention. Like it had an enormous fortune, and instead we see that in many cases, again, this is just not there. There were many peasants that were free, that were capable of, they had their own little rural communes. They would pick up arms to defend their land. They would even actually impose themselves with force. The peasants were historically, for some of the most radically and traumatically violent elements of the entire society. I mean, by far, like, just the Clausewitz in Trinity, he says, like, the primordial hatred belongs to the social element, to who makes the humans of the hierarchy. And of course, the peasants had this incredibly wild mentality themselves, which would prevent even like in their limits, like the development to something actually more cohesive. And so the story is they were oppressed, but actually they sort of lost the perennial chance of sort of living in a better way. But I'm not going to make philosophy of history today, like we'll talk about it another time. We find some rare witness of terms like, for example, adscriptus glebe or adscripticius. So a sort of, it's like a peasant vinculated juridically to his land, right? And this was very impressive for the first scholars of rural history for the Middle Ages, that even after Mark Bloch's researches even contaminated his conclusions, right? So it had been imagined. So Bloch, died during World War II, so we're more or less that time in history, and he was like a structuralist and everything, but there was essentially like this idea that the serfdom of which Bloch spoke was referred to centrally to those men in a better condition compared to the slaves, which instead it was the general condition, right? And while the slaves essentially in Western Europe had disappeared, like unless we're talking about, I don't know, people that had been kidnapped from the Crusades, or I don't know, there were some geographical regions in Europe that were sort of more dividing, like, I don't know, think about Ireland for the English, right? Of course there were Irish slaves even up to very recent time, or think about the Slavic pirates in the Adriatic Sea. The Venetians would regularly plunder their lands and take captives and selling them to the Muslims, where it was sort of normal. But otherwise, like the entire Western Europe, the hinterland was made up by freemen, right? There was no way, just even no need to alter that. There was no, again, it would have not served the purpose of the same masters. These guys had to be productive. You had to leave them a certain liberty, a certain autonomy, so that they could be working. And there was, again, no other distraction from this. I mean, yes, there was war politics, but without the peasants, you couldn't do anything. And these guys were the first ones who had put themselves under your protection, because you were instead the guy who would protect them. And then you had the church that sort of spiritually informed of the whole system, like the imperial authority, and that's how the system organically worked, also in a pretty good way. But of course, here we're talking Bloch, we're talking other times. Bloch here was not responsible. I mean, of course, if your theory is informed with Marxism, well, it's extremely difficult that anything even remotely intelligent is going to come out of it, because Marxism is just for the culturally inferior, like in the personally inferior, and it has nothing to do with history that requires a degree of personal superiority to be handled in the first place. This is the deal. So it was wrongly believed that fundamentally de facto slaves would have just been tied impositively together with their heirs, like forever, to cultivate the fields to which their lives would have been conscriptively incardinated. This is really not witnessed. We see a very few cases in which entire groups of peasants had actually been tied to the land. We have them, for example, even in very otherwise like places where people had just acquired a general liberty. For example, in the countryside around Bologna and Vercelli. So we're talking northern Italy, where people had essentially, in terms of individual wealth, like the highest in the globe at the time. So you understand even how actually the exception could derive from not much greater imbalance, but greater, as we've seen, even concentration, variety of cases, but also just because the place could be better documented. Right. I made a video actually explaining about how the Longobards passed from colonists to massari in their peasant development. Or at least, of course, there were different statuses at the same point, but these are some of the areas in which that individual liberty from the countryside is actually even fostered to some degree. So it's really, really, really wrong to think that in the Middle Ages was a wide and homogeneous category of serfs when not actual slaves tied to the land that couldn't move, couldn't do anything. This is not real, right? It's completely made up. So some of these were the exceptions that we were describing were serfs. So as we have seen, they had a limited liberty just in virtue of their juridical condition. And it was thus limited for everything, like not just the fact that they were tied to the land. Could make many examples across Europe. Think about the German ministeriales. We will keep talking about them, and especially in the original phase in the 9th to 10th century, because those are very, very exemplificative of how, for example, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, individual liberty was very small in the first place. We see also many, free colonists that could be persecuted by a tribunal, a seigneurial one, or even a communal one, because they had abandoned their fields, but they were not wanted and condemned because they were tied to the land, because they had rebelled to this connection that they had to be just staying there. They were prosecuted because they had broken a contractual agreement, right? And this normally was lasting, in this case, 29 years, or even maybe to life. But these guys had, especially as freemen, as we'll, like this example explicitated, not they had engaged freely into the contract with their lords, who were, of course, not happy to have accepted this and seeing these guys breaking their plans. There would be, by the way, some privilege connected with this this contract, like with this the conditions, like the family head had essentially accepted to ensure a lifelong or even hereditary contract of location. They hadn't been wanting it. They thought it was advantageous. So if, say, one peasant fled the fields because, I don't know, for whichever reason, to even earn somewhere else, and for an entire reason they had not worked at, there could be some problems. For example, the lack of manpower, like of labor force, for some reason or another. Well, in that case, the masters could ask for contractually for their amount of due, and this was all part of a freely engaged contract, and escaping from the land in that case was just, okay, I will not have myself found, all right? And these guys could flee to, I don't know, places that were not under the Lord jurisdiction, so it was all a consistent problem for that matter. It would take, in fact, sort of different characters depending on the circumstance, but you understand that this has nothing to do with a situation in which there is a de facto slave that is tied to the land and cannot leave. It's a guy who has joined freely into it, and under some advantageous conditions that somebody else would have had and didn't have, right? Naturally, you can argue, but, you know, what was the absolute level of wealth around? Well, again, in this case, it's 15 pretty high overall, right? These were not particularly affluent people, but it doesn't mean that by finding this kind of contract here means that, I don't know, in other places where people were worse off, they had better conditions. As a matter of fact, they would and could have much worse ones at a point. Besides, the peasant mobility during the High Middle Ages starts being something very concretely fueling different types of community development. All right. Some of these people were literally fugitive serfs, right? But many were the freemen that, living as colonists but finding different conditions, had tried to subtract themselves to the rhythms of the great seigneurial system, the courtes, right, to search for fortune elsewhere in faraway regions, often to just keep, working the land, keeping to work the land, but also in the city, where they could dedicate themselves to different mansions. These were not, again, like desperate people who had fled the countryside because they had not accepted their personal juridical condition. They were freemen that had broken an agreement that, of course, could be unlawful to some degree, but that only for that, not for any other reason. They could be obliged just to be, at least they could be punished, but they could not be simply brought back. Just to make you picture how much true it is that the personal freedom is, let's say, connected, for example, with, think about the urban development, right? And the fact that the greatest urban development in this period is, we've seen it often, the one of communal Italy. And in communal Italy, you have the largest growth in Europe in terms of individual cities, and the degree of people that, of course, this growth demographically doesn't occur because people were just making children more. It's just because the city becomes really rich and people from the countryside want to go work and live there, or in the surroundings, in the suburbs that eventually are, walled, etc. Well, at the peak of the communes, there were as many people living within the city than in the countryside. This is insane. It shows you how much push there was from the countryside, but the fact that half of the people was in the countryside and half in the city tells you how many of the people that lived in the city as well were former peasants that thus were not tied to the land. And this, as we've seen, constitutes essentially 1/5, let's cross out southern Italy, of the entire European population. 1/10 actually, and these were essentially people who could move from the countryside and live in the city. So just picture the dimension by which they were free to do that. And it's not like the cities were, and the most important thing about this example is that the city in Italy controls the countryside. So, of course, there was sometimes even we've seen it at the communal capacity to enforce its authority on noblemen of the countryside, but they were de facto the same people ruling the city. So this is a consistent part of the European population, exemplifying that there wasn't such an oppression in the way these people would move in the first place. I mean, I'm not aware specifically of peasants who were invited to live in the city. It was just people who could move by themselves, and that were capable of doing so autonomously, just knowing what the general demand, what the general situation was, right? And so this, I think, is a very good example to prove that the dimension by which this liberty was there. The process of widening of the Massaricum and the shrinking of the Dominicum, by the way, once starting, never stopped. Right? As we exemplified also in the most feudal areas, like the general dynamic is that there is a very, like, this doesn't correspond to the weakening of the lords. On the contrary, it's just like what we observed for the communes just right now, right? The great landowners appreciated the commodity to have a very narrow seigneurial reserve dedicated exclusively to the useful production for the seigneurial family. Also, like specialized crops, for example, and also more expensive products like wine, right? So that you didn't need to superintend directly over too many depending workers, like workers that you had to control, you had to spend for. You could just think about, this is like the latifundium, essentially, like a broader Massaricum as an area for which to get the products that, if you left, in fact, in the hands of people that had a certain autonomy and that still were under you by some degree, so definitely not people you had to be just with a sword behind their back and that could have even rebelled. And think about the Jacquerie, and think even in moments of actual weakness of the peasantry compared to these ones historically, you could simply, like, these people would produce the stuff would become on the markets, these people would just work on your own land, and they would pay you these cannons that were granted, and plus you would exact the tolls because you had all an authority if you were part of the feudal system of the public hierarchy and so on. So this system would work by itself. This is typical feudalism, especially of big, wide areas. Think about France, like the sheer amount of people and agricultural resources concentrated there, and a very few noblemen that really rule everything and have, of course, they are invested also in the local, say, the specialization of some crops or whatever, not just for the Dominicum, but that just get a lot of stuff back just by owning that land. That was prospering in many ways, especially during the 12th, 13th century, without too much trouble, even though the chivalric elite was dominant over the system as well. So it's very positive development. You could also, like, normally the canons for the peasantry was stable, like not like a percentage varying on the basis of how much they produced. So this was actually they were not particularly low cannons, but they were like simply like at a certain level, so that however it went, in the good times, like the peasants were not extra squeezed, right? And they could produce more for you in general, like for the markets, for the general wealth of the system. In this way, by the way, during the bad years of poor harvest, or even a case of a true and proper famine, the sacrifices were imposed exclusively on the colonists that had in any case to pay the lord in nature and or in money, and the seigneurial economy was not hit by it. Right, so that you would just have this contract, and generally speaking, what you got from the production that thus swung together with this, say, the natural course of, say, the general course of the agricultural productivity. The limited dimensions of the Dominicum rendered at that point superfluous the corvée. These would continue until the end of the Ancien Regime, but the easiest way was at this point in the later centuries just nature and money, and not this extra working performance as the entire canon painted. Right. In other words, in say the most difficult centuries like the 9th, the 10th, but the 11th, you had the corvée because they were a way to, like, times were tougher and you needed to squeeze more strategically out of it. Like, you didn't have to exhaust the peasantry, but if they had some if there was a possibility to gain more without oppressing them excessively, you could, on the basis of the contract, to exact the corvée. Later, say in the 12th or 13th century, the corvée actually diminished because there was enough product. There was, say, the situation was also more chaotic to some international degree, and the important was just to extend your control on vaster areas rather than being, say, so concentrated just on the micromanaging of the local economy. All right. It's again this passage of even autonomization of the further autonomization of the peasantry. So that's why I say that, you see, here this peasantry was in this willing condition of de facto serfdom, which is not slavery. Many people are free, they want and they can move depending on the situation. Of course, in the early Middle Ages there were more freemen on average, but did they actually live better or have this liberty? No. Right, so think about this when you think about, again, more freedom individually is more freedom to do what if you do not have the means. More freedom if you have the means is great, but if you don't have that, right, and civilization develops in a way in which people actually are better off with less liberty. Literally, like there are the failing systems in which again, things are where everybody wants to be equal when everything goes down because the system does not, the hierarchy is destroyed, or at least it's sclerotized and in the hands of people who have nothing to do with the actual, know how to make things actually work. Think about socialist systems. And so the lack of stratification brings to the lack of merit, of capacity, of whatever, and the system collapses and gets worse. But in a system like ours, what the communists by envy call capitalists, which means that they want to steal from you because they are poor ranks, you actually have the best quality of life in a highly stratified system, right? Well, of course, generally speaking, the balance in wealth at the bottom of society is important as well, but overall, like, there is enough opportunity to rise if you want. So this is, even if everything is, there is a stronger state, for example, there is a coercive capacity, this is civilization, and both things can coexist, and seemingly people today are at large not capable of distinguishing, like the fact that the reality is double-threaded. It's not just like a dichotomy. In any case, we are in the 11th century when this passage happens. The corvées are reduced. In some areas of Europe, the courtes ended already sort of in the first decades of the 11th century. In others, only between the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th. So the historians look at this saying, like, the courtes did not really disappear, it sort of territorialized. What we mean by that is essentially that the courtes was not just like a local farm in a specific area, in a circumscribed area. The courtes passed to be the feudal state to some degree. Like, it's of course there are some, like, maybe this is an exaggeration, because of course it's not that the feudal states were run in like a courtes, but this gets surpassed as the general hierarchy increases. And so there are literal feudal, veritable feudal monarchies that are seigneurial in nature. They're built in the same way, aside from the Dominicum and the Maceration. That's really what I meant. But even in that, in the royal domain, for example, there is some of that. That's also different, and that's also how some courtes, in fact, work there, as opposed, within those territories, as opposed to others. But the nobility had pretty much, let's say, the vassals had pretty much the same system, and then eventually start having functionaries. Again, it's a lot of stuff, but to intertwine in a single video, but I hope you get it. Some toponomastic remains from the courtes, for example. In Italy, again, there are lots of places like Corte Maggiore, for example, the major court, which corresponded, that's the name, to the center of the courtes, right, that is extended in a certain area. So then you have Corte Regia, which is the royal court, which is the name attributed to the head of an old royal fiscal, royal domain, courtes. Corte Nuova, that gives also name to a very important battle, as you know, Frederick II. This name derives, the new court, right, from a courtes born in an area later compared to the others. So you see how much even just a name can reveal about the courtly dynamics. That courtly system, the center, normally continued to be an important seigneurial estate, right? But not as a courtes anymore, at least in the way it worked. It didn't work anymore on that basis of, again, the Dominicum and the Maceration. It was framed into a higher system of control and organization. As we've seen, the rise of the cities, the strengthening, for example, of the urban industries, the financial activity, these are all things that began to profile also the role of properly a third estate, for example. There are all the ingredients for what, especially the so-called commercial boom of the 12th, 13th century really is. But it did start from essentially what the seigneurial system in the previous ones had been able to provide as an agricultural basis. Naturally, even if the Dominicum and the Maceration disappeared, this is still the consequence of that progressed structure and mechanism that has just improved itself. It's ever more interconnected, as we've seen. It is born exactly to be not a closed but an open system, and so that's why there is nothing more idiotic to present that the manorial system, the courtly system, how you call it in different areas, is a closed one, because it is born to be something more, to transcend, to go beyond localism. And it could have not really be done otherwise, because the extent of the court in itself was beyond the previous basis in which normally, like, the individual peasants had tried to make things work, or even the clan leaders, or whatever. And when we talk even later of the 14th century crisis, we're witnessing the latter exactly because Europe had manifested in the 2 previous centuries an incredibly dynamic development that would be broken again by wars, not just local ones. I mean, the entire system had been supported by this enormous output. And so when the means become destructive enough to weaken, to burn out, to exhaust, whatever, and then the plague arrives because the immunitary defenses are lower, whatever, you have famines, plague, all the imbalance that we've seen. I have an entire playlist, as you know, for this period in history. You realize that also, in fact, the peasantry was suffering enormously, that they were actually the first ones to suffer this, because so much surplus had been accumulated that the bigger powers were trying to knock each other out by using this power to destroy actually the the basis. The same thing about the the same chevauchée or whatever was properly aimed at disarticulating the local agricultural production, weakening the enemy, make all the hierarchy appear like inadequate for protecting the peasants that, as we've seen, had sort of joined in a contractually free way the system, right? So this is an incredibly important passage to realize, right? So the period goes between the 9th, the 11th century. I made a video about, made an entire playlist dedicated to seigneurial Europe, this phase, it's a post-Carolingian Europe, if you want, fairly overlapping with it, is strongly based on the Cortes. It's strongly based on this new contract that was, in fact, in turn at the root of the great medieval civilization of the the beginning of the late Middle Ages, right? And the cause, by the way, the precondition of the general economical revival, the commercial takeoff, right? That had never, right, crashed down, never stopped flying, right? But it was flying very low for quite a while, and just like coinage had never ceased to be issued. But the Cortes, in fact, would have not had a raison d'etre if not by properly expanding on this. The markets were there. There wasn't just barter, right? We're not primitive savages, and in case you didn't realize, the Dark Ages, the Latin Germanic word wasn't by far. Small landowners had not disappeared. The mobility and labor force of the freemen had not been reduced to the condition of some sort of slave tied to the land. Simply and gradually, in the 12th century, the surplus of the agricultural production, so what had been accumulated, also back in the day through very primitive means, began to be reinvested in new systems, like the income was, the earnings were coming. The same landed seigneury was the one carrying out these investments in the cities, in the kingdoms. Like it was really becoming something that really was well based to be able to do that. It was not an equilibristic thing, right? It was also gradual, right, and stratified, and especially in the cities, you see the agrarian, artisanal, and financial activities that mirror how, of course, these had control pretty much on the entire on the entire system, including the countryside. That's where things were being directed from. So this, in my opinion, is quite relevant because it observes the dynamism of a time in history that we just thought to be flat. Right? That is not to say that the peasants, as we've seen, did not have reasons to want to be connected with the land, but the rigidity or the oppressive, asphyctic, closed, uncompetitive system is something that, for the Middle Ages, you cannot afford to claim at any level. It's simply ridiculous. Right? There were times in early modern Europe that the system was not as active and productive as the medieval one. Right? So there are so many different pictures, so many different realities that I make these videos, and I don't know how much of what I say sedimented systemically in the audience, how much my thoughts are sort of leaving a mark, but it's important to affirm the reality of what historiography has already notoriously discovered, let's say. But it's also a matter of just being honest with yourself and realizing that if you want to know history at any level, you must do it in a way that gets to the actual deal of the matter. That does not stop to what you... I see it on YouTube. People want to hear things like the way so-called creators choose topics is exclusively to beg for, like, look, I believe the same cliche that you do, click on this. Right, and then it's just a very mild and critical, unresearched, let's say, unchallenging view, right, of history. This is not how we're properly meant to work or to think history itself, right, for political, civic reason. And I think the Middle Ages are by far, exactly in this time, the most powerful indicator of what we should think to approach reality like in a comprehensive, fragmentary or just atomistically separated or deterministic or materialistic or fatalistic or superstitious way, but in fact the way these people had it. Great part of our fortune rests actually in the achievements of these people, which is what you hardly hear for the Middle Ages, and that I personally immediately learned when I started studying history, and never faded and was reinforced at every step of the way throughout my career. Right? Well, we will keep talking about this. There's a playlist about rural history, medieval agriculture, etc. Right, but for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.